I'm Sophia, otherwise known as Mrs. Crash Cart. And today I'm going to be doing a clothing autopsy. Now, I know that you're used to watching mechanical objects, computers, toasters, microwaves, dangerous objects destroyed in this lab. And today we're going to be destroying things, but we're mostly going to be destroying clothes. Now, the first thing you need when destroying clothes is a pair of really good scissors. That's what these are. See if we can get those close up on those. These scissors are Gingers. Now, Ginger makes the best brand of sewing scissors out there as far as I'm concerned. They are extremely sharp. You could kill someone with these scissors. You could cut off your finger with these scissors. You cannot operate these scissors under the influence of any mind-altering substance whatsoever. Even caffeine can be dangerous. So I picked these scissors up at my local sewing store. They're available pretty much everywhere. They're a really, really good tool to have, but you do need to be careful when using them because they'll slice through multiple layers of fabric and occasionally your person before you realize what's happening. So pay attention. That's our tool for today. The first thing we're going to take apart is a pair of trousers. Now, this is a classic cut that you might see in pajamas. It looks like this when it isn't cut up. I'll hold that up for you to see. You're looking at your basic drawstring pajamas. And if you've ever wondered what the actual piece of fabric looked like to make drawstring pajamas, that's what we're going to find out today. Now, to do this clothing autopsy, I'm going to just cut along the seams of these pants. I will not be able to sew these pants back together again once I've cut up all the seams because I'm not being careful. I'm basically doing a hack and slash job so you can see what shape the pieces of fabric are before they're sewn together. I'm going to start with the side seam. In this pair of pants, the side seam is right here. And I'm just going to follow the side seam all the way down the pair of pants. There's a pocket in here which has been sewn on top of the fabric. If I wanted to remove that pocket, I could get a seam ripper and pull out all the stitches. If I wanted to make a pattern of that pocket, I could do that. Now, one of the advantages of cutting up a piece of clothing like this is that you can easily see what the pattern pieces look like. If you have a piece of clothing that you just absolutely adore, but it's wearing out, and you just can't make it last another moment. You've already applied all the heart patches and unicorn patches that you can possibly do, and you're running out of Hello Kitty patches, whatever. You might want to remake the piece of clothing, and in order to do that, you need to know what the actual shape of the clothing is. So there, I have one side seam. I'm going to turn this inside out. Sometimes it's easier to see the seam on the inside. We're just going to follow this piece right here. Notice how these scissors cut through this thin cotton fabric like butter. Say that with me, everyone. Like butter. That's what you want. You want scissors so sharp they cut 3/4 inches of leather like butter. All right, so I'm almost done cutting up this pair of pants. Believe it or not, there aren't that many seams in a pair of pants. The next seam I'm going to do is the crotch seam. This is the part that goes between your legs, and it's the curvy part. Once again, I'm going to go from the inside out so that I can easily see where the seam is. This is kind of a complicated piece of fabric. It's got lots of stripes and business. I'm not being super careful because this is just for demonstration purposes. There we go. This is one side of a pair of pants. And I kind of want to show you what this pattern looks like so far. We do have one more seam left to do. This pants is made into 4 different pieces. But if you notice, the shape is kind of a Y shape. You've got a curve here. This goes from front to back. And this line goes down on the side of your hip. All right, now, because the pants are identical in both sides, I really only needed these 2 pieces to recreate this pattern. This is the front piece. I know that because it has a pocket, and I made sure to pay attention to where the pocket was before I started so that I would know where the front was. Now, I want you to notice in particular this curve right here. While pants, when they're on, look like they're all straight lines, it's not true. They're usually straight in the hip seam, the seam that goes along the outside of your leg, and the inseam, the seam that goes from your crotch all the way down to your ankle. But this seam is the important one. This is the one that makes it fit and makes it not bunch up around your waist. And this is the curve that really matters. It's going to be different in the front and the back. This curve is fairly shallow, and it goes right like that up to the top of the pair of trousers. This is the back of the trousers. And you can see that this line right here is the exact same length as the inseam on the other side, and this is the exact same length as the hip seam on the other one. But this one is really different. This has a lot of ground to cover in order to fit you. So this curve is much deeper. It's a much deeper curve. And that's important to know. If you're making a pair of pants for yourself and you got a lot of badunka in the back, you're going to want to make this curve particularly big. You can go deep into the fabric as long as you make sure you have enough up here to get around your waist. If you're flatter in the behind, you can make this curve more shallow. And that is an autopsy of a pair of pajama bottoms. I'm going to move on now to the autopsy of a pair of dress trousers. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I really want to show you how similar these 2 shapes are. There isn't a lot of variation in the pieces that make up clothing. Now, these trousers are going to have this placket in the front with the zipper, and that is a complicated piece of sewing. There are a lot of tutorials online that you can find that show you how to put one of those in, or you can buy a pattern that will teach you how to do that. I'm not going to do that today. And it's got some other features, like it has pockets that have been inset into the fabric, not sewn on top like in our last version. It's got a waistband instead of a drawstring, and that's why it needs the button and zipper closure, because this is going to fit exactly at the waist. There isn't enough here to get over your hips. It's going to be narrower at the waist. And so you have to be able to open it to get it on and close it to finish it up. And it's got an inset pocket on the side seam as well. But at the end of the day, the shape of the fabric is going to be fairly similar. And I just want to point out to you that when you're looking at couture clothing, or you're looking at really, really high quality, expensive clothing, it's not the shape that's different. It's these other things, like the fact that all the seams have been finished in this garment. You don't have any rough edges like we saw in the other one. Here, There's adjustment room in the back in a really good pair of pants. You're going to see that this has lots of fabric there so that you could take it to a tailor or do it yourself and adjust the back of the pants to make it fit just perfectly. That's how you know you have a really quality garment. I've lost my tools. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with the last pair with this pair and show you what the shape of the fabric is. Look at that. I don't even have to use my scissor action. These scissors are so good. I can practically just slide them along the fabric the way you do Christmas paper. I'm just starting on the side. You don't have to. If you're taking apart a piece of clothing at home, you want to see what it looks like when it's deconstructed. It doesn't matter what seam you start with. Now, once you know what these shapes are, you can adjust them to fit your body the best. So if you're a runner and you have really big thighs, you can add fabric to that section of the trousers if you're making your own pants. And if you have nice childbearing hips but a really small waist, you can make adjustments for how much fabric you put in the hip area versus the waist area. And later on in different videos, I'm going to show you how to make adjustments to clothing in order to make those things fit a little bit better. This is going to be a little tricky because I've got a zipper here. I'm actually going to cut around the zipper. I prefer not to cut through a zipper with these scissors. You can. These scissors could handle it. I could probably cut metal if I really needed them to. But it would put a dent in them, and that would be less fun. So once again, you can see that these pants are almost identical to the ones that we had before. You've got the front curve, which is a lot narrower, and you've got the back curve, which is a lot deeper, and everything else is more or less straight. I'm going to cut down this one more seam to show you that once again, you do have 4 pieces in this pattern. You can actually do a pair of trousers like bloomer style in 2 pieces, but you need really wide fabric if you want it to be wide enough at the waist. Most fabrics only come 45 inches wide. You can buy them as long as you want. You can buy as many yards as you want, but they're only 45 inches wide. And so you can get them at 60 inches wide, but it's a lot harder to find fabric that wide. You mostly want to make everything out of 45 inches. Unless you're making things out of tablecloths, and then it's just like whatever you have on hand. There we go. There's the back. You can tell from this deep curve. Okay, we're going to go on to something a little bit different. The things we've done so far have been woven fabric and trousers. And now we're going to move on to a t-shirt. So if you've ever wondered what a t-shirt looked like when you cut it up, that's what we're going to show you now. Now, looking at a t-shirt, you can see that most of it is pretty square. It's a giant rectangle with a curve in the top for the neck. But what I really want to show you is the arms, because you're going to see that this arm is not a perfect rectangle. It's actually got a curve to it. And that makes enough room to go under your armpit. I'm actually going to start by cutting off the sleeve. I'd also like to show you this part up here. It doesn't go straight across. If I line it up with the edge of the table here, you can see that it doesn't go straight out in a T. And that's because most of the time your shoulders don't go straight out in a T. And if you had clothes that were cut that way, they would hang kind of funny and put bunches of fabric here, which stylistically is appropriate for different ethnic clothing, but is not necessarily what you want in a fitted t-shirt or a t-shirt that fits. So you really want to notice that when you're making a shirt, this is going to have kind of an angle to it. And that angle is going to follow the slope of your shoulders. The more slopey your shoulders are, the more you want to increase that angle. And the broader your shoulders are, the less you're going to have that angle. Now, it may look like this is identical on both sides, but it's not. So I'm going to be really careful and cut right along the seam. This is a t-shirt sleeve. And what you may notice here is that it's not the rectangle that it looks like when it's on your person. Instead, it's got a real curve to the top of it, and even here. This gives room for your upper arm muscles and for your chest muscles, and it makes it so that you can move easily in the t-shirt without having it pull against your body. I'm going to cut off the other sleeve, and then I'm going to cut down the sides. This sleeve happens to be symmetrical like the other one. Like this is the same. In more tailored fashion and in different styles, these are going to be different, and you really need to pay attention to what sleeve you're working with. I have sewn the left sleeve to the right side so many times in my career as a seamstress that I can tell you this is really important to keep in mind. If you're using a fabric that has a right side and a wrong side that's really obvious, it's easier. And if you're using a fabric where both sides look identical, you want to mark it with chalk. You want to mark it with chalk as soon as you cut it out, before you've even unpinned it from the pattern piece, because it'll be so hard to tell later. And then you'll have your arms going back like that when you sew them onto your clothing, which is not as stylish as they say. And it's really easy to get it wrong. In fact, there was one project where I was making a ball gown, and I literally sewed the left-hand sleeve to the right side twice in a row. Can't believe I made that mistake twice in a row, but it happens. T-shirts are based on, oh, this one's a tube, awesome. All right, so one thing about t-shirts is that sometimes the fabric is sewn, it's built on a tube. They have a giant machine that just turns out giant tubes of fabric. And so if you have a t-shirt with no seam on the side, that's what's happening. This one is a t-shirt like that. I clearly did not prep this as carefully as I thought. We'll cut down the side anyway so you can see the shape. But when you are making things out of t-shirts, looking for a t-shirt that has been made out of a tube can be really cool because you have a more uninterrupted fabric to work with. And that's something to pay attention to. Everyone's checking their t-shirts now. It's adorable. All right, notice the top of this t-shirt is, here, I'll lay it out on the table so you can see. It's got a curve to it too. I'm going to cut right down the side so that I can show you exactly what it looks like, exactly the curve. When you're cutting on a fold, one way that you can do that is to lay the fabric out, smooth it, hold it with your hand beyond the cut, and just slide your scissors up. And that will cut right on the fold. And sometimes it's easier to do it that way than to try to like open it and cut along that line. If I opened this up, it would be really hard because the fabric is stretchy and it can get away from me. I don't have a clear line there to follow. If I ironed it, I could iron a clear line in, and that's helpful. But if you just want quick and dirty, you don't like irons, for whatever reason, maybe you had a tragic iron incident in your life and you're just not willing to go there yet, this is a way you can get around using an iron. Irons are extremely useful in sewing, but they do increase the amount of time that you need to do things. And if you need a ball gown and you need it in 2 hours, you want to try to avoid ironing as much as possible. All right, so here is our t-shirt shape. Now there is a front and a back to this t-shirt shape. This is the front. Sometimes the neckline on the front will be wider than the neckline in the back. The neckline in the back will come up like this, but sometimes it'll be exactly the same. And you can see, once again, that we've got these curves. It's almost the same curve that we saw in the trousers, but this one is meant to go under your arm, to go around your anatomy and under your arm. And you can see that this is a straight shot, straight down, if I get the fabric to lie straight. See if I can pull that out a little bit. It's not cooperating, but you can tell it's just a straight cut all the way down. If you want a fitted t-shirt, you're actually going to cut, you're going to sew in here and back out again, and that's what's going to make the t-shirt conform to your shape. We'll talk more about that in a different video. So that's what a t-shirt looks like. I'm going to move on now to a fitted shirt. There are a couple of things I want to point out in this fitted shirt. First of all, it's bright pink, so I don't feel bad about cutting it up. Secondly, it's got lots of attachments on the front for decoration. We're not going to pull those off, but if I wanted to, I could get a seam ripper and cut those out. What's really interesting about this shirt is the back. I want to show you these pieces right here, and I don't know if the camera can zoom in here. It's a really bright color. But what we have here is a dart, and this is an extra piece of fabric. I don't know how well you can see it. It's an extra piece of fabric that allows you to shape the garment. And you sew it in, but you don't cut it. We're going to talk about darts later. But this is what a dart looks like when it's finished. And basically, the fabric was pinched like this in the middle of the fabric and sewn in this shape, and that makes the shirt fitted. That's how you fit a shirt. This shirt has ruffles and a collar, but not a pointy collar like a men's shirt, which we'll do next. It's got a button placket on the front. and it's got fitted seams. I'm going to cut the most basic seams first to give you an idea. I have to start with the neck. So I want you to notice this ruffle. See how ruffly it is? See the level of ruffle? Okay. When I cut this off, you're going to see how big this fabric actually is, or how long. If you have a ruffle attachment on your machine, it normally does 2 to 1. It's set to do 2 to 1 most of the time. You can adjust it through tension and stuff like that, but it's generally 2 to 1, which means that you are going to use 2 inches of ruffle for every 1 inch of fabric that you're sewing it down to. So that's quite a bit more fabric just to make that ruffle. It's thin. I can cut it out of the side of a piece of fabric if I'm making my own clothing, but notice that it's quite a bit bigger. In fact, if I were to hold it up to the collar itself, you can see that it's not quite twice, but it is a good almost twice as long as the collar piece itself. This is the shape of that collar piece. It's almost perfectly straight, but then just at the edges, it curves in a little bit, just right there. And that makes it fit a little bit better against your neck. Because strangely, people are not made out of planes. We're not rectangular in shape, we're curvy. Even the skinniest of us are curvy. I'm going to cut off the sleeves now. I'm really excited to show you these sleeves because a puff sleeve is almost just like the sleeve we saw in the t-shirt, but they've made one change to the shape of the pattern. And the first thing I have to do is cut off this cuff. The cuff is just going to be a rectangle. Cuffs are super easy. People get really intimidated by them, but they're actually really easy to add to anything. And if you have a shirt that you love, but the sleeves aren't long enough, you can add a cuff to it in a contrasting fabric, and wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, you're all set. If you have a pair of trousers that you love, but they're just too short to be fashionable, you can do the same thing. And there is the cuff. It looks almost like the collar, it's just a rectangle. All right, so here is the puffed sleeve of this shirt. Puff sleeves were really popular in the 30s and 40s and make a resurgence on a pretty regular basis. And let me just get off some of these extra bits so you can see it clearly. I want to show you the difference between these two sleeve shapes. You'll notice that they're the same in that they're both widest at the center point. This is the part that is at the top of your shoulder, and it needs to be the widest. They're both widest there. This shirt, however, has a much more pronounced bell curve to it. In fact, this curve is a lot wider than the opening that you're sewing it to, and that's why it gets gathered at the top, and that's what makes the poof. This bottom line can be straight. For a more poofy sleeve, you can extend it down like this, and that'll give you more poof at the bottom than the top. So if you're looking for a bell sleeve, that's one way to do it. And it also has to be gathered in order to fit into the armband, which is so pink I can't see it, which is shorter than the sleeve. So that's why you gather it here in the middle and attach it to that, the cuff. When you're making a sleeve, it's just these small changes in this curve that make all the different sleeves of the world. So if you want a long sleeve, you just extend this down, and we're going to see that when we do the dress shirt. And if you want a poofier sleeve, you can cut this here and here. And if you bring these out like that and cut your new piece along these lines, you'll get a really puffy sleeve and have to gather it quite a bit, but it'll give you a nice full sleeve. So if you're making something and you want it to be poofier, that's one way to do it. Here's the shape of the front of this shirt, and you can see that the armhole is really pronounced. It's got a lot of way to go around a person, and you can see that the neck hole is hardly there. I mean, it's just really not that deep at all. The actual width of your neck is very small, and so you don't need much curve in that piece. When I first started sewing, I overcut the neck time and time again, and I'd end up with collars that came way out to the side. If you want a really tight collar, it's going to be that narrow right there. I'd also like to point out that right here is a dart. I'm going to cut along the dart. It's sewn in, but I want to show you what it does to the fabric. It makes room for your girls, ladies. So it's basically a V shape. And what they've done to create that V shape is they folded the fabric over like that, and then they just sewed here along that line. And that creates extra room here, extra fabric here, and less fabric here, which makes room for the curve of your bosom. If you don't have that, you can have fabric that presses really hard against the front of you, which is not always the look you're going for. There's a similar cut here, a similar dart here, which is going to bring the fabric in towards the waist and then leave room for the hips on the outside. And let me do that so you can see. It goes in here at the waist and then out again for the hips. And that is in the fabric like so. The fabric itself has been cut in kind of a curve right here and then sewn along the edge there, but it's not a separate piece, it's built into the piece of fabric that we're using. We've also got a placket for buttons. This is almost identical. It's the same technique that you use to make a collar or a set of cuffs. It's a long rectangle that you sew to the front cut in the shirt, and it's got interfacing in it to reinforce it. and that's where you're going to put the buttons in the buttonhole. Buttons on one side, buttonholes on the other. It may interest you to know they're reversed on men and women. On women, the buttons go on the left and the buttonholes go on the right, and in men, the buttonholes go on the left and the buttons go on the right. My grandmother told me it was so that husbands and wives could undress each other more easily, but I don't know if that's true. We still do it today, though. So sometimes you'll be in the men's section of a thrift store, and you'll find ladies' shirts, and you can tell because the buttons are on the opposite side. So there's the pattern piece for the front. These are separate, those ruffles, and here's the buttons. Now the other side looks exactly the same. It just has buttonholes on this piece instead of buttons. This is what the back of this shirt looks like. And it's been tailored even more with these two darts that run along the side that make it a little more fitted, that gather fabric towards the middle and leave it out in the top where your back muscles are and in the bottom where your hips are. You'll notice that the curve at the top here is much wider than the one that's on the front of the shirt to reach all the way across from collarbone to collarbone. And you'll notice that this curve is much less deep. It's deeper in the front because it's got more person to go around than in the back. You have less business going on back there. If, however, you have really big shoulders, you're a swimmer or you do a lot of chin-ups because you're that person, you would want to increase this curve and maybe bring this out more when you're trying to make your own clothes. That's what the back looks like. It's not laying flat because of these darts, but even this seam right here is not straight. It comes in towards the waist and out again towards the hips to leave room for curvy parts. All right, the last piece that we're going to dissect today is the pièce de la résistance, a men's dress shirt. Now, the reason I saved this one for last is that the men's dress shirt pattern has been almost the same for over 100 years. And the differences that you see in history books in terms of clothing are really very small changes to a very basic pattern, but I can talk about those. And if you are making a costume for Halloween or you're a reenactor, this is going to help you create the clothing to look appropriate for your time period. So this is a basic men's dress shirt. It's not fancy, it's made out of cotton, it's not a designer label. You can find those things, and what you're paying for is how well the seams are made and what the quality of the fabric is. Sometimes you're paying for the cut. So if you buy a really expensive shirt, there's been some geometry involved and a lot of math to make that shirt fit your body just perfectly and to make it the most attractive. It's going to accentuate your shoulders, de-accentuate your waist, be slim in the hips, that kind of thing. So that's what you're paying for when you're buying a really nice shirt. I'm going to start with the collar once again. By the way, for those of you who think that you don't do math after high school, you're wrong. You do math all the time. People who make clothing do a ton of math. Which, by the way, was a cruel thing to discover after I graduated from high school. The last shirt that we did, the women's shirt, it didn't have a collar, it had a ruffle at the top. This shirt has almost the exact same pattern at the top, but instead of a ruffle, a pointed collar has been included. Now, collar shape has changed through time. Today, collars look like this. Let me see if, I can do it this way. There's a very, very gentle curve here, which makes the collar lay nicely against your neck. And for the most part, you can see by these lines, which is why I picked a lined fabric, that it's a pretty straight piece of fabric. This is the point. And you'll see that this point is not very big. Today's shirts, the point is not a particularly pronounced point. If you go back in history to the 70s, you're going to see a point that comes way out like this. And if you go into the Victorian era, you're going to have a curve here instead of a point. But that's it. That's all you got in a collar. In the Victorian era, this would have been longer. Oh, by the way, if you're a reenactor and you're doing the mid-1800s, shirts were just made without the collars. And the reason for that is you bought the collar separately. It was often made out of stiff paper, and you attached it with buttons to the shirt. So if you are looking through a catalog of Western clothing, historical Western clothing, it's going to have shirts like this with no collar. This is called a Nehru collar. And it's very popular in Western-style shirts and Victorian shirts. So here's the under part of the collar. It is the same width, more or less, up here as that original piece that we cut off. You can see they fit together like this. And you'll notice that this one is curved that way, and this one is curved this way. You would think those two things wouldn't actually fit together when you're sewing them, but they do. It's called easing, and it's possible because fabric is not paper. The whole point of having fabric is that it's woven and it adjusts. You can move it. Those fibers slide against each other along the diagonal. And that means that you can force a curve like this to match a curve like that perfectly. And what happens is, in 3 dimensions, it makes the fabric curve around your body. That's what those curves are for, and that's why geometry is so important in drafting patterns. You'll notice that at the bottom here, you have a gentle curve that's going to attach to a much more pronounced curve on the shirt collar, which I'm going to show you right now. This opening at the neck of the shirt is much wider than the one that we saw on the women's shirt. It is not a perfect circle. I want you to notice that specifically it's kind of oblong shape. It's wider in the back and not as deep, and it's deeper in the front. This is because your back is straighter than the front of you. And you'll notice that it doesn't close all the way if you just put these pattern pieces together. And that's because you don't actually wear a circle around your neck when you're wearing a shirt. You're wearing something that comes over the shoulder, down around the back, over the shoulder again, and down around the front. So it's kind of more melon-shaped, if that makes sense. This piece, which is so straight, actually does fit on here. And when you do that, you're creating something that'll stand up. And that's how you get the collar to stand up. That's what's happening. In the Victorian era, this piece would be much taller. They would have worn their collars way up against the top of their throat. And today, we wear them quite a bit lower. I'm going to cut the sleeve off now. You're going to notice a lot of similarities between this sleeve and the other one. The more advanced, or not advanced, but the more tailored your shirt is, the more complicated the pattern, the more pieces there are going to be in the sleeve. In the Victorian era, when they wanted a very specific shape to the sleeve would actually come in 2 pieces. And that created a sleeve that was actually formed to go curve along the line of the arm, so that when you held your arm at your side, the sleeve would kind of be curved forward. And I only know this because I sewed that sleeve on backwards. I sewed it to the wrong side, so it was curving back, and it didn't look good. It looked really odd, actually, and we had to take the whole thing apart. So in a sleeve on a men's dress shirt, you really have to pay attention, once again, to what side you're on, because the pattern is not going to be identical from side to side. And you want to make sure that you get the right side on the right and the left side on the left. Couple of things to note on this sleeve. If you lay it out sideways like this, you can see a nice big curve here. On a men's shirt, they're not going to go as close against the armpit as in a women's shirt. There just isn't the need. It goes quite further down on the rib cage. And that's why this sleeve is so wide. It's also an extra large shirt, so it's for a really big guy. And a really big guy, this is not going to be as long on his person as it is on me. I could wear this as like a dress, right? But I'm only 4'2", so that's why it looks so big in my hands. You'll notice that the sleeve isn't as long as you might expect. I always end up cutting my sleeves too long. It's just because when I look at it, it looks like it's going to be longer than it is. But if I were to put this up at the top of my shoulder, which is where that fold is, you can see that the cuff goes down to my fingertips. I'd also like to point out that a cut has been made in the fabric here. And this is the piece of the sleeve that has the opening so that you can get your hands in and out of the cuff, but when the cuff is buttoned, it's tight against your wrist. That way it doesn't fall over your hand and get dirty. But in order to make it tight enough in your wrist to not go over the wider part of your hand, you have to have an opening there. Now, when you're first starting to sew, it's acceptable to put that opening in the seam, but it's not good tailoring. It's not traditional. It's acceptable. It's what lots of people do when they're first starting. There are designs that are built that way. It's something to look for. When you're ready to do a more advanced piece like a shirt, you're going to need to learn how to do this piece here, where you're putting a covering around the raw edge of the fabric that you've sewn into the side of the shirt, and that's just something to think about. I want to show this before I cut it. They've put 2 pleats here. You could also do a gather stitch right here. Pleat is because the shirt is wider than the cuff. You want the shirt to be wider than the cuff. You want it to be kind of poofy. And in order to make it fit nicely against the wrist, you have to bring that fabric in some way. You can do it in a gather stitch like we saw on the pink shirt, or you can do it in a set of pleats like we see in this one. And the fabric has just been folded. I'll show you how in just a moment. Notice these fabulous scissors are cutting through something like 6 layers of fabric like butter. You want to say that with me? Like butter. So I'm going to show the overhead camera here. This is a pleat, and it's just a zigzag pattern. This is a basic pleat. Later in some of the other videos, I'm going to show you a box pleat, but a pleat is just a zigzag. And you use 3 times the fabric in a pleat. So if gathering is twice as much fabric, pleating is 3 times as much fabric. You'll see here it's 1 length, 2 lengths, 3 lengths for this one space. So that's what the cuff looks like. It's a big rectangle. You can see from these lines. They're cut fairly well. You can tell the quality of a shirt if it has a pattern by how well they've lined everything up there. If you have a really high quality shirt, they're really going to pay attention to lining up the rectangle with the stripes on the shirt or with the pattern. Something to think about. You don't see it when you're wearing it, but you'll know it if you find it. Here's our shirt pattern. Note it's a lot wider at the bottom now than it was. And this is a finished seam. Maybe we can bring the camera in really close right here so you can see if that's possible. This is what's known as a French seam. It's a finished seam. I'll put that like that. If you look at both sides of it, you can't see the raw edge of the fabric. So it's finished here, and it looks very neat, but it's also finished here. It's been sewn down on both sides, and the raw ends have been tucked inside the pocket that's made by that fabric. And this is a really advanced seam. If you have a machine that'll do it for you, it's super easy to do, but if you're doing it by hand, it can take a lot of time. The advantage is this seam will never come out. It will never come out. The zombie apocalypse will happen before this seam comes out and this fabric unravels. So it's a matter of quality. Now, if you have small children and they're outgrowing their clothes every 3 months, this is not important. If you're getting married and you want that dress to last for your grandchildren's wedding, then this might be important. But that's really the only time that you're going to put your effort into that. Unless you're one of those people who just likes to do everything as best as it can possibly be done. And if you're that person, then you're going to want to learn how to make these seams. They're called French seams. They were developed originally for really fine, high-quality fabrics like thin silk that shred and fray very easily, where the threads come unwoven very easily. So you didn't want any threads sticking out anywhere, or you could literally unravel the cloth itself. And that's why they developed these seams. There's no ends to get caught in anything. I want to show you how similar this looks to the other sleeves that we've looked at. You've got this curve here. It's a lot longer down the arm, but you've got a very similar curve here. If I were to find the shirt sleeve from the pink shirt, oh, it's just way over here now, my pile of scraps. Oh, that's the one I cut up, the diddle. Maybe I won't show you. I'll show you on the red one. That'll work. So here's our t-shirt sleeve. Notice they're really similar. Now, this is a bigger shirt. It's for a bigger person. And here is a t-shirt. It's for a smaller person. But you'll see the curve is really similar. Now, if you were going to have a puff sleeve, this curve would be more pronounced here. You would have a curve that goes way in down here to fit under the armpit, and then way up to have lots of extra fabric to put in that gather. But a basic shirt that just fits into the armhole is going to look more like this. Here's the opening for the button on a traditional cuff. So here is the front side of our men's shirt. Zhuzhing. Notice a very familiar curve here. The straight shoulder that isn't perfectly straight, it's not, let me show you that across the top there, it's not straight out like that, it curves down, it angles down somewhat. You've got the sleeve with the curve here to go under the armpit, just like we saw before, and it's the same curve as we saw in the trousers. This has a pocket sewn on top. That's one way to do a pocket. It's a flat pocket. There are 20 million different ways you can do pockets. That's the easiest. And you'll see that this is totally straight. Ladies, men tend to be straight. They tend to be straight down from the shoulders. Girls have curves. If you were going to make this shirt for a woman, you would need to bring this in towards the waist and out again in order for it to look nice. Otherwise, you're wearing a sack. Gentlemen who are extremely athletic and have a lot of upper body muscle are going to actually have a shirt that comes in like this if it's tailored, because their shoulders are bigger than their waist. So if you're on the football team and you have these big broad shoulders but you have this really narrow waist, then you want to get your shirts tailored so that they come in towards the bottom, and sometimes in and then straight down. But just so you have the fabric at the top to fit your shoulders, and you don't have too much at the bottom poofing out. Now, if you are a historical reenactor or you're making a costume, it's interesting to note that the difference between this shirt and a shirt from the past is the amount of fabric. This line here would be longer. The shirt itself would be wider. It would look identical in terms of shape. It would just be wider at the top, and then you'd be gathered here. And in general, in historical times, the more fabric you had, the wealthier you were. You could afford lots of fabric. So if you are making a costume for someone who's quite wealthy, you're gonna have lots of fabric at the top here. The other side of the shirt and the other sleeve looks exactly the same, so we're not going to cut those open. But this is the back. There are two pieces to the back of a men's shirt. There's this top part and the bottom part. When you're buying a shirt, you want the top part to go from the edge of your shoulder to the edge of your shoulder. So this is 20 inches across, just about. That would mean that you would want from this edge of your shoulder to that edge of your shoulder across the back to be 20 inches. If it comes down, then it doesn't fit properly. So a really well-fit shirt is going to have the arm seam right there at the edge of your shoulder. I have a terrible time with this because I have no shoulders, like they got lost in translation. So I'm always bringing in the shoulders of my clothes. This top part here, it fits really nicely against the top of the back of your person. And it should be fairly smooth. That's a fairly flat place on a human being, so it usually fits quite well. And I want you to notice that there's another pleat here. This is a box pleat. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a little bit. But this gives a little extra fabric for the back of the shirt, and that makes it easier for you to move in the shirt. Some shirts don't have a pleat here. Almost all of them do, but every once in a while you'll find a shirt where the designer didn't put one in, and that's a really fitted shirt. That shirt's going to be fairly tight. There's no wiggle room for movement. If you're doing historical clothing, this piece here is going to be a lot wider, and it's going to be gathered here instead of pleated. Once again, historically, the more fabric you have, the wealthier you are, so you would try to get as much fabric in that shirt as possible, and then when you tuck it into the waistband of your trousers, it's going to poof around your waist. So this is a box pleat. They've actually sewn it into the fabric, which is a mark of quality in this garment. A box pleat is where you fold the whole thing in half, like so, and you sew about 1.5 inches in from the fold, like that, not all the way down, just like 1 inch. And then you open it up, and you flatten it so that the two sides are even. You can see that from the center seam to the edge is the same as from the center seam to that edge. And that's a box pleat. Box pleats are used all the time in clothing. They're used in the backs of shirts. They're used at the tops of skirts. If you want a really full skirt. Ladies, you will see these on the tops of skirts all the time right now. They're very fashionable to have a skirt that's fitted through the hips with box pleats and then is fuller at the bottom. You'll see that all the time. And they're pretty easy to do. One is super simple. More than one is more complicated. You have to do a lot of measuring and a lot of math if you want them to be evenly spaced and to use the same amount of fabric for each one. So if you're buying a pattern, that math has been done for you. If you're doing it on your own, you can wing it. It's hard to tell just by looking that it's not perfect. But if you're somebody who cares deeply about everything being the same, you're going to have to do a lot of measuring and marking and math. Once again, math after high school. So this is the shirt pattern itself for the back. It's a giant rectangle. If I cut down the seam, you'll see that it's not really angled the way it looks. Pretty good, huh? I almost got only the fabric, just this little tiny piece. All right, so you'll see that we've got a curve here like we expected, a curve here. Now, it's not very tall because you have to remember this piece is going on top, and that will be the rest of the arm right there. So if you're cutting out a pattern for the first time and you're like, wow, that's really not very tall, it's because there's another piece coming. And you can see it's not that much wider than up here. You only need a little bit of extra fabric to make it easy to move in. And it mostly goes straight down. It's very rectangular. Once again, if you were going to have a fitted shirt, this side seam would angle in like that. If you're a woman, it's going to angle in towards the waist and out again for the hips. Now, this is something that people do in shirts so that when you sit down, your shirt doesn't come out of the back of your trousers. You'll see that it's a little longer towards the bottom. There's this extra fabric put here, and that is just so that when you sit down, it doesn't pull out of your trousers. There is an equal matching curve on the front for the same reason, so that you can reach up for something and pull up on the shirt, and it doesn't pull out of your trousers or skirt. If you're somebody who does a lot of bending over, you want to make this as long as possible, and so that it stays in your shirt no matter what, and you don't have any unsightly images. So this is your basic pattern for a shirt. You'll notice it's not that different than the patterns that we saw for the women's tailored shirt or the t-shirt. They're all on the same basic model, just like we saw earlier that the trousers and the pajama bottoms were almost identical as well. I want you to know this because I want to make sure that you understand that if you start sewing, you're not actually going to have to learn that much in order to be sewing almost anything you can think of. All those special techniques and those giant books and magazines devoted to sewing are for the tiny, tiny changes and details that you learn when you're an advanced sewer. To be a basic sewer, you can sew almost anything that you want to, and an entire wardrobe easily with just a very few basic techniques. And those are some of the things that we're going to be covering when we do additional videos on the introduction to sewing and manipulating cloth. You'll be able to find those at thegeekgroup.org. Is that right? Geekgroup.org. Okay. So I'm going to finish up here, and then we're going to start some videos on how to make clothing. And thanks for watching.
This video was made possible by a grant from the Future Girl Foundation.
This video was made possible by thousands of private donations from members and viewers like you. Please visit thegeekgroup.org for more information on how you can donate and become a part of our dreams of Avalon.